Why does China relentlessly covet and seek to dominate the South China Sea? South China Sea, three words that are more than geography. They represent a pressure point in the global system, a hidden switch embedded deep inside the machinery of trade, security, and power. And if China ever places its hand firmly on that switch, the world will not hear an explosion. It will hear a faint click, and then everything gets repriced. This is not a story about rocks, reefs, or even oil. This is a story about leverage without war, control without occupation, and power exercised quietly enough that markets react before politicians do. China's obsession with the South China Sea is not driven by hunger for territory alone. It is driven by something far more strategic and far more dangerous: the ability to shape behavior without firing a shot, to make nations hesitate, to make corporations reroute, to make insurers raise premiums, to make investors whisper the word risk in boardrooms thousands of miles away, from New York to Frankfurt. What you are about to hear is not framed around outrage or ideology. It is framed around incentives, around systems, around the uncomfortable truth that in the modern world, the most effective form of power is not domination, it is dependency. The South China Sea is not just a body of water. It is a vault of influence, a laboratory for gray zone warfare, a symbolic battleground of national identity, and a mirror reflecting the deepest anxieties of a rising empire that fears being contained, humiliated, or cut off. And once you see it that way, one question becomes impossible to ignore. Why does Beijing keep returning to this sea again and again despite global suspicion, legal defeat, and regional backlash? Because the South China Sea is where the future rules of the 20th century are being quietly tested.
Welcome to the Cloud News, your destination for dynamic perspectives on economics, technology, and financial investment. From market fluctuations to intriguing social trends, we bring the world to you through in-depth analyses. It's not just news, but a lens to help you understand the world that is shaping today.
Before we dive into the map, let me say something that makes a lot of people uncomfortable. China doesn't crave the South China Sea only because of oil, fish, or scattered reefs. China craves the South China Sea because it is a place where power can be manufactured without declaring war, where a state can pressure an entire region to adjust its behavior, and where markets in New York and Frankfurt end up bowing to a single variable: risk. The Clown News doesn't sell panic, we sell clarity. And clarity begins with one question: why does Beijing keep returning to this sea like an addiction? Why build islands, push ships forward, draw lines, and persist even when the world grows suspicious? You're about to see why. The South China Sea is treasure, fortress, a stage for national pride, and a mirror reflecting the deepest fear of a rising empire. The South China Sea is the throat of global trade. If you want to understand the South China Sea in financial language, forget slogans and follow the flow. The flow of goods is like blood, and the South China Sea is like an artery running through the neck. You don't have to squeeze hard to control a body. You just have to place a hand there and the body starts to listen. Picture a normal morning: oil from the Middle East, liquefied natural gas, minerals, grains, consumer goods, electronics components. Everything moves along maritime lanes as if it were destiny. But in markets, destiny isn't permanent. Destiny is insured, and insurance is priced by risk. Raise tensions by a single notch and hull insurance rises. War risk premiums rise, shipping rates rise, and then the final price rises on the supermarket shelf. The darkest irony is that people who couldn't point to the South China Sea on a map still pay for it anyway. China understands this, and this is what many political analyses miss. Beijing doesn't view the South China Sea only through the military lens. It views it like a systems manager. Control the heartbeat of trade, and you gain leverage without firing a single shot. But hold on. If the South China Sea matters so much to global trade, doesn't China need it to stay open? Yes. And that's the paradox driving the obsession. China depends on open seas to grow wealthy, yet it fears open seas because open seas are where rival navies can appear. The larger an economy becomes, the more it resembles a giant ship. To move fast, it needs fuel, routes, ports. But the bigger the ship, the more it fears being blocked at a choke point. In China's strategic mind, the South China Sea is a buffer against the fear of being choked. And when a great power feels a hand on its throat, it will do almost anything to breathe, even if the entire region ends up suffocating with it. Resources are the BATPREC is the real prize. People talk about oil, gas, fisheries. Sure, those are the bait, but bait isn't valuable only because it has meat. Bait is valuable because it pulls the big fish closer, presence. An oil rig doesn't only drill oil, it drives a psychological stake into the water. A fishing fleet doesn't only fish, it creates facts on the surface. A Coast Guard ship doesn't only enforce law, it trains the other side into a reflex, back off to keep the peace. This is what I call an empire of habit. You do something provocative, the other side protests. The world gets distracted. Then you do it again tomorrow and stronger the day after. Not because you don't fear reactions, but because you are measuring exhaustion. And exhaustion is the enemy of law. International law survives on the patience of states willing to defend it. When that patience runs out, law turns into paper. China doesn't only want resources. China wants the right to shape presence. Who can enter? Who must ask permission? Who gets blasted by lasers, warned by loudspeakers, cut off by ships that accidentally cross the bow? These incidents don't make Europe's front pages every day, but they go straight into the risk files of corporations, insurers, and investment funds. And here's the conspiracy layer I promised at the start. You don't need a secret conspiracy to produce secret outcomes. You only need clear incentives, repeated long enough in silence. The South China Sea is a lab for GRAZONE warfare. The 20th century liked wars with names. The 20th century likes wars with no birth certificate. You don't declare war. You manage disputes. You don't invade. You enforce law. You don't militarize. You upgrade infrastructure. The South China Sea is the perfect laboratory for gray zone strategy, always below the threshold of official war, but enough to erode opponents day by day. You deploy Coast Guard vessels the size of warships. You use maritime militia as a legal fog. You dredge and build islands and say, my land. You install radar and say, defense. You build runways and say, humanitarian support. Each piece looks plausible on its own. But put them together and the picture becomes obvious, a control system. Gray zone warfare aims at something more valuable than territory. It aims at behavior. When a regional country begins to ask, should we even go out there? Gray zone warfare has already won half the battle. When a company asks, is this shipping lane still reliable? It wins more. When a government asks, is escalation worth it? It wins the rest. Winning by making others self-censor is the cheapest form of power because the other side pays for its own fear. The South China Sea is a security belt for an anxious rising power. Now put the map aside and look at the psychology of power. China is a rising state, and every rising state carries two obsessions, being contained and being humiliated. Contained because geography isn't poetry, it's a cage. China's eastern coastline faces the Pacific, but access to the deep ocean is screened by the island chain, Japan, Taiwan, the Philippines, and America's regional footholds. In strategic minds, it feels like a fence. A fence is tolerable if you plan to stay in the garden, but if you plan to become a maritime power, the fence becomes a humiliation. Humiliated because modern Chinese history contains the memory of coercion, gunboat diplomacy, unequal treaties, carved spheres of influence. Those memories are taught and retold in ways that become political fuel. And political fuel, once burning, always demands more oxygen. So the South China Sea is not only strategy, it is symbol. And symbols are more dangerous than strategies because strategies can compromise, symbols cannot. When territory becomes part of national identity, you cannot concede without being branded a traitor. When a line becomes belief, you cannot erase it without shaking the entire story. That's why the 9-dash line survives like a ghost. It doesn't need to be legal. It only needs to be repeated long enough to become the default in public imagination. The 9-dash line as a political religion of no return. Have you ever wondered why an ambiguous map is defended with extreme persistence? Because ambiguity is an advantage. Ambiguity means you can stretch the claim depending on the moment. Today, you speak of historic rights. Tomorrow, island sovereignty. The next day, security. Each rationale is a different jacket on the same body of ambition. And ambition prefers not to be boxed in. But the cost of ambiguity is permanent tension. You can't sign peace with an unclear border. So friction becomes the default state like background noise in a room. Live long enough with the noise and people stop noticing. And that is precisely when the system changes without anyone's permission. The South China Sea becomes a place where China tests a new kind of power, the power of establishing facts. Build something, protect it, and then call it normal. And here is what hurts smaller states the most. It's not that they don't protest. It's that they protest in a world with limited attention. The most persistent actor often wins, not the most correct one. The South China Sea as a gate to the Pacific and a lock on the door. If China only wanted to defend its coastline, it would not need far-off artificial islands. But if China wants to reach outward, protect energy routes, and project power, it needs forward positions. In military language, you'll hear terms like anti-access, denial zones, layered defense. In the clown's language, China wants to turn nearby seas into a room where others must knock before entering. And here, the US-Japan alliance alongside regional partners becomes the shadow behind the story. Because every Chinese step in the South China Sea doesn't only affect neighbors. It triggers the reflex of an alliance structure. Patrols, exercises, bomber flights, these aren't just theatrics. They are risk signals. They tell the market this route must stay open. And every time these signaling systems collide, risk rises. When risk rises, costs rise. When costs rise, political pressure rises. And the spiral begins to feed itself. This is not only a naval contest, it's a contest of trust. A hard truth rarely said out loud. Modern power is not only weapons. Power is trust, the belief that you can uphold the rules of the game. Europe cares about the South China Sea not because it wants to fight in Asia, but because Europe lives by trade and predictability. When a route becomes less predictable, the business model of export economies shutters. Companies don't wait for formal bans to withdraw. They withdraw early because fear is cheaper than exposure. Investment funds don't wait for war to rebalance. They rebalance early because risk doesn't ask permission. And here's the coldest truth. The more the South China Sea is perceived as a place that can be opened or closed, the more capital will quietly look for alternative paths. This doesn't happen overnight. It happens in risk reports, board meetings, and the fine print of insurance contracts. You may not see it on television, but you will see it in prices. MIDROL hook, 30 seconds, wrong 30 months paid. I want you to picture something simple. A Coast Guard ship closes in too aggressively. A supply boat panics. An aircraft flies lower than usual. A signal is misread. A young officer refuses to lose face in front of cameras. Just 30 seconds wrong. No total war is required. Just one incident big enough for markets to believe the route is no longer reliable. And when trust breaks, it breaks in financial style, fast, cold, and emotionless. Capital pulls back, premiums spike, oil jumps, carriers reroute, supply chains tighten. Inflation returns like a ghost. Do you see it? The South China Sea is where a small tactical error can trigger enormous strategic consequences. That's why great powers obsess over it. Whoever controls the threshold controls the heartbeat. What China really wants, the power to define this sea. Now we get to the core. China wants the power to define the South China Sea on its terms. Define who is provoking. Define who is violating. Define where my waters begin. Define which laws apply and which are merely suggestions. If you can define the rules, you don't need to occupy everything. You only need everyone to behave as if you already have. That is the peak of power, winning in the mind before winning at sea. But the price of definition is maintenance. Maintenance requires ships, bases, propaganda, and the inability to appear weak. And that is where the ominous prophecy enters. A system trapped inside symbols becomes vulnerable to mistakes. Every empire reaches a moment where it believes it can keep stretching the cable forever. But cables have limits. The most dangerous moment is not when the cable snaps. It's when it vibrates, because vibration triggers chains of reaction no one can fully control. The South China Sea is not just a destination. It's the final test of a superpower. There is something few people dare to say plainly. The South China Sea isn't only where China wants to go, it's where China must pass if it wants to become a true maritime great power. And must is always more dangerous than want. A country can exist for centuries without controlling the ocean. A global superpower cannot. A superpower needs roots, protection of flows, the ability to project power beyond the shoreline, and above all, the mentality of a state that is not trapped inside its own backyard. So the South China Sea becomes China's coming-of-age test. Pass and China enters the Maritime Power Club. Fail and China remains a land empire wearing a Navy uniform. History's cruel joke is that the biggest tests rarely come with retakes. From land empire to maritime obsession. For thousands of years, China was a civilization that largely faced inward. Its power was anchored on land, farmland, population, internal control. The sea existed, but it wasn't the center of power thinking. And then, history punished that orientation. Sea powers arrived, gunboats opened doors, unequal treaties followed. The feeling of being penetrated from the ocean burned into collective memory. This is the part many Western analyses miss. The South China Sea isn't only strategy, it's historical trauma. A state that was once beaten from the sea never sees the sea as neutral. The sea becomes a latent threat, and when a traumatized state rises, it doesn't seek balance, it seeks absolute control. The South China Sea and the Malachy Dilemma. Let's talk about Beijing's deepest fear, being cut off from lifelines. More than 80% of China's imported energy moves by sea. Much of it passes through vulnerable routes. And in every strategic map, the Strait of Malacca appears as a haunting bottleneck. The South China Sea is the road leading to that bottleneck. Control the South China Sea and you don't just protect your route, you reduce the ability of others to control you. In power politics, reducing dependence is increasing freedom of action. That's why China pours massive investment into naval power, bases, and artificial islands, not necessarily to start a war today, but to purchase the right not to be coerced tomorrow. But buying freedom by pushing risk onto others creates blowback, and that blowback is forming. When the South China Sea becomes a risk printing press for global markets. Here is a cold fact traders understand better than politicians. Markets don't care who is right. Markets care who moves volatility. Every time the South China Sea heats up, something invisible appears. Risk premium. No sirens. No emergency banners. Just a few lines added to valuation models. War risk insurance. Supply chain disruption premiums. Higher capital costs for projects dependent on maritime logistics. And the most dangerous thing is when risk becomes the default. When CFOs, pension funds, and global logistics firms begin treating the South China Sea as a permanent instability zone, they do the only rational thing: reduce dependence. No bans required, no sanctions required, only prolonged anxiety. And so the very sea China seeks to control to protect growth becomes a source of drag on that growth. Europe, the silent observer that is not innocent. Many Europeans think the South China Sea is far away, but in finance, distance isn't measured in kilometers. It's measured in dependence. Europe lives on trade, logistics, and predictability. A maritime corridor doesn't have to close to cause damage. It only has to become uncertain. And here is the hard truth. Europe doesn't have to choose America to be pulled into the South China Sea. If Europe invests, insures, and ships, that is already enough. That's why when the EU says de-risking, it isn't just a political slogan. It's accounting language. And accountants don't have nationalism. They have balance sheets. The South China Sea and the War of Time. If you watch long enough, you'll see this isn't a contest of who is stronger today. It's a contest of who can endure longer. China is betting it can absorb pressure better, control society more tightly, and sustain strategy longer than democratic rivals. The United States and its allies are betting the opposite. Open systems absorb shocks more effectively. Costs can be distributed, and in the end, markets will vote with money. The South China Sea is the hourglass of these two strategies. No war required, only time. The most dangerous moment when no one wants war, but no one wants to back down. History rarely ends with a perfect plan. It ends with an accident inside a tense environment. A ship turns too late. A plane flies lower than expected. A young commander wants to prove he isn't weak. The South China Sea is full of moments like this, not because people are foolish, but because the system is tight. And in a tight system, small mistakes can trigger big chain reactions. No one wants war, but many are betting war won't happen, and that bet, by itself, is a risk. In the end, we return to the question we began with. Why does China relentlessly covet the South China Sea? Because the South China Sea is where China can prove it is not only richer, but freer. Not only stronger, but unblocked. Not only rising, but recognized. But history is brutal to empires that place all their honor into a narrow space. Every empire has a place where ambition meets a ceiling of reality. For China, that place may well be the South China Sea. Today, the South China Sea still has waves. Ships still move. Trade still flows. Everything looks normal. But history doesn't change in loud moments. It changes in periods that look stable. I'm the clown. And if there is one thing I want you to remember after this long video, it is this. When a sea becomes a symbol, when law becomes a story, and when markets start whispering about risk, what's happening is no longer a territorial dispute. It's a stress test for the 20th century order. And that test is still underway.